All right. Well, so we're here to talk about big data and open access and integrative and innovation. And the question here that we're posing, because we've heard a lot about, all these big data ideas. We heard Patrick earlier. We heard it came up in the insurance and the pharma panel. But how much of this data, we've got data in electronic health records, we've got data that's been crowdsourced, we've got data coming from clinical trials. And the question is, how much of this data can we start to use now? When does this actually start to become something that changes our practice of actual medicine? And I wonder what Sue thinks about that.
I think we have to start with a reality check on what's possible. So what we've tried to do, and what I try and do as we think and talk about this, is be really clear about what the vision is and what the reality is. So the vision for me is that all data that is self-generated, whether it's with a self-monitoring device, check your blood pressure at home, your exercise habits, your diet, that all that data and the data that multiple different care providers, whether it's a Minute Clinic or whether it's an academic medical center, that all the data that has to do about me is available and translated so that my caregiver can use that data to take better care of me. And on top of that, that all of the new data on my clinical experience, whether it's in a research mode or a care mode, contributes to that data set. And my data is poolable with others to take better care of me and my family. Now that's the vision, that's the dream, and we're on our way to doing that. It's good I have my cheerleader here.
Yeah.
So
witness. Yeah.
The reality is that every single day, academic medical centers and other hospitals have HIPAA and have fragmented care delivered in silos. So that, one, we have very tough rules on patient privacy and very big fines if we don't follow those rules that scare people and impede the flow of data. Now, I'm all for privacy, so don't misunderstand what I'm saying, but HIPAA, and particularly a lack of clarity on how far a researcher can go to make things happen, is a real challenge for us. And secondly, we have siloed care and siloed data. So every single day we deal with that. So what we're trying to do now is we have two pilots going on at our place. A pilot in brain science, which is the furthest from understanding insights, where we put images, sequencing, and care information into a data set for frontotemporal dementia, the leading cause of dementia in people under 60. And we're trying to create a knowledge network in that early form of dementia, and breast cancer, which is the furthest along. We know a lot about different kinds of breast cancer. So we think in creating two knowledge networks, we can start to bridge from a world today where much patient data is not used to their benefit to the world that I described as the future we're all looking for.
So I agree with everything that Sue said, but kind of another way to look at what we're trying to do, how big does the data need to be to do what, right? And I think we've been talking all day about value, right, to create value. And we've been talking about you need certain benefit based on certain effort. I think in circles that we have our hands around data already where there aren't HIPAA issues, like in clinical trials. I mean, Josh was talking earlier today about how we could be looking at different diseases, regardless of how many patients suffer from them, from a mechanism of action perspective, and actually get more information out of data that's already being collected, that's already sitting in systems that pharmaceutical companies have access to and can be leveraging, academic centers as well. And I think Sean made a really interesting comment when in the pharma panel around operations, right? So if value is what you're getting for some level of effort, a great way to increase value is just to do less work. And there are ways to use the operational information that we have in existing systems. I think whether they're at a pharmaceutical company from a clinical trial perspective, get more efficient in monitoring, get more efficient in study design. Even last year in this same panel, we were talking about operations in emergency rooms, right, driving better outcomes for patients coming in with cardiac conditions. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's a lot of value in what we have now, and we don't need to get much bigger. I'm all for bridging everything that we obviously possibly can as well.
But I think you said something really important I want to pick up on, and that is patient-driven. So if patients drive, the bringing together of data, that is patient-directed and sort of a safe space to operate. A very important thing rather than hospital-driven or doctor-driven.
Yeah, I guess I would add, I mean, I agree with HIPAA as a constraint. I agree that there's,
You guys don't have to agree.
oh, I'm about to.
We'll get there, I'm sure.
Fixing to disagree right now. I agree that you can trickle along and get some exhaust that's useful off of what's happening, but fundamentally, data is way too small and really misused, I think, against what we could be doing. You know, the biggest obstacle is not HIPAA, which is a big obstacle. It's the edifice complex, right? It is the people building the systems are people trying to fill buildings because they're seeing patient days per 100 drop half a day a year, even with the aging of the population. And they got to put those heads on those beds, right? And they got to either get, they're buying doctors to raise prices so that they can get more money per head on bed, but they also just want to keep those beds full. So the orientation of the systems are around billing and around referring stuff into the hospital. The truth is, as we get to smaller and smarter drugs, no academic medical center has enough patients to really do a good trial. And the right way to run a trial is not to drive them downtown and put them in the Greenberg elevator to the Schwartz Pavilion and to the, follow the yellow line to the green line to get your MRI. It's to get it in the community and be able to connect to it there. So just as we used to have, you have to slow down at the bank machine to see if it's Cirrus or NICE or whatever on the, these networks must connect into a larger network. We must move off of closed, information as a proprietary source of referral advantage, a positional billing advantage, and more towards it's the store you go into to get your product. It's not the product itself. And I think that's a big block. And I think it's going to come off. I think this internet thing is going to be big. You heard it here first, Forbes Healthcare too. But as that happens, I think this will open up. It'll free up the Susans of the world to do a lot more creative stuff because they have much more robust information that reaches much further than just the doctors that they employ or the patients that they have into their facilities. They can reach across many facilities. And it'll be guys like Medidata and guys like Friends Organization getting people to say, as you were saying, letting people, yes, use me extra. Use me a lot, and you can have everything. Here's photos of my body parts. Use everything. I want to. Amy Abernathy at the TEDMed talked about, like an organ donor. Like I want to be a data donor. I want you to use everything. You can identify me. Go for it as a thing that people could raise their hand and do. But if it's isolated into 5,000 different hospitals, each with their own separate systems, or worse, 150,000 different doctors' offices, each with their own systems, it's going to be a tough row.
Well, Stephen, talk about data donors. It's a perfect segue to you.
So first I want to agree with Glenn, the comment that I think everyone should leave here with, which is there's plenty of data out there. I want to echo what Jonathan, you said, which is, and it's never going to be enough, right? So that's not an oxymoron, right? There is plenty of data out there and it's never going to be enough is a coupled phrase. So I think the thing that is exciting is we have plenty of data to take some test cases, similar to that breast cancer and the brain imaging that Sue mentioned. And I want to give two examples, and then I'm going to go to what I think is a much tougher issue than the data. So the two examples are a project that we've been running on the anti-TNF therapies. So I think most people...
Enbrel, Humira,
right,
some of the best-selling drugs in the world.
Right, the ones that are advertised in the evening news almost all the time. As probably most people know here, it's only about 1/3 of the patients who get a benefit from those drugs. And everyone, from the patient to the payer to the drug discoverers, would actually like to know who it is that actually doesn't need to take that drug. And so in a project that we've been running, so Sage Bionetworks, which is where I am, has been coordinating, we've been collecting clinical data, 10 different clinical trials that have 3 or 4 different companies' drugs on them, putting all that clinical data, putting the genetic information, and hosting it up in the Amazon cloud. That place allows then us to run challenges, open collaborative analyses, the way we did for breast cancer and aggressiveness in breast cancer last year with thousands of women to see who had aggressive breast cancer. But in this one, it's about response to a drug. And why I bring that up is Part of that is actually the Arthritis Internet Registry, the AIR data that's coming in from the Arthritis Foundation, and that's directly from patients. So now, these are approved drugs coming directly from patients, going up in a cloud, where you can then do the analysis, and that analysis it's such that the winner of that challenge doesn't need a monetary prize. What they need is a recognition. So it's for the ability to have that data as part of a paper in a prominent journal, Nature Genetics, and that actually the winning solutions can drop into a clinical trial and actually be validated. Now, that's sort of interesting, but I think it gets more interesting in that we've been talking with the FDA about how to make sure that a qualified biomarker can come out of it. Because what you really want, if you're a payer or a patient or a physician, is imagine trying to find that subset of patients where it's less than a 15% chance that that person is going to get any benefit. So where it gets to where a clinician goes, this is less than 15% chance of working, similar to the RAS activation in some cancers. It's actually helpful to everyone to know that. And
So I hear a challenge.
Can I ask a
in
question, though? Does that combine registry data with any randomized controlled study data?
it is.
Because I think that's a really interesting point
Which is
around
exactly
big data.
the question I was going to is for you and for Jonathan, how do we make it so that what you do
Yep.
is
Right.
talking to that kind of system? How
Yeah,
is it so that when I go into an EMR, I can volunteer to?
Yeah, front desk. Check your ABN form, check your, credit card,
I'd be a data donor.
bill on EOB, and check your trial volunteer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really
And
important.
it's healthcare, so you just set all the defaults.
Which
and
is,
everyone will do it 'cause
imagine that
nobody
now
cares.
it's not
Until they do.
1,000 patients with
Until they do.
arthritis, but in fact, that's open now to anyone who's actually taking an approved drug, and it's not just in arthritis. And imagine that everyone is being tracked, because there's no question that at approval time, the drug is defined for a particular indication, and over time, there's no question that actually it can be better aligned with really who it's working in.
Yeah, I think when I think of the phrase big data, one of the things that I think is an underlying rule is we don't actually know what we're going to do with that data on the outset. We're not collecting it for a specific purpose. And I'll disagree with one piece of what Jonathan said, just for fun. But I think we actually do agree. But that is that sometimes like system exhaust, the stuff that you didn't realize was going to be important later, you were just collecting because you had to, becomes really actionable and interesting in a big data context. Again, we have a lot of experience of that in clinical trials. People have been collecting audit trail information for decades, and they wrap it up in a little piece of plastic and they put it in cold storage. I can tell you every detail about the operations relating to inefficiencies in clinical trials by analyzing all those audits that the industry is creating and not using. I am sure that if you start to look at a placebo or a controlled randomized study and take that data and combine it with registry data or combine it maybe with claims data that we weren't,
Yeah.
financial data that we weren't thinking about using,
Sure.
we could get new insights into what patients should be taking certain drugs.
And
That's
metadata
valuable.
is one of the great detective agencies of the exhaust trail world. And it's true, that's cool. But kind of wouldn't it be better if we could just step up into the data flow, into
Of
the
course, I
river,
agree.
and turn the knobs and say, of course we don't know anything about what we want to know yet, right? We're in such the Stone Ages in terms of the number of cycles of our dialectic learning with data, right? Because, nobody's had anything for decades except for CPT codes, which were made up just to get paid, right? So we're just starting. And I just see, how often is Amazon doing a new version now? Is it like 7 times a day they float a
Eight, I
new?
think. Eight.
Eight
Yeah.
times a day, right? What's the average hospital system refresh? About every 18 months you get a new version, and it takes 18 months to install it, and the lights go dim as the hospital cranks up the new install version 1.11 or
And ICD is every 15 years.
And every
National
15
specification.
years you change your
And
code
we
sets.
have stalled. But I think it's sort of, you're
This is
making a really
something-
important point.
This is
Yeah.
that.
So it's like he said, hey, we've got a lot, we've got enough, but compared to what we ought to have to bear, but everybody else except for us at the kids' table here at healthcare have,
Well, medicine's
$2 trillion
hypothesis
worth-
driven in reality is not.
What's that again?
Medicine is hypothesis-driven, reality is not.
Actually, can I stay with that
But
for a
isn't
second?
reality more interesting? Go ahead.
It does get back to one point that was the end of that intro, which was, and what we're really missing. Right? So the description you just gave about hypothesis-driven analysis and the benefit that it is that's there now for doing data-driven analysis, which is, I think, where you were going. I think the thing that people haven't appreciated in the big data dialogue is how critical data scientists are in learning how to mine that data and to do something with it.
Yeah.
So I think that we're getting to the point where people are getting intrigued with donating data. I think the ability to do things with large data, we're going to look back, and it is going to feel like a Neolithic time when we really didn't know what we were doing. It's sort of like what the iPhone was in 2007.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I don't think has come into the dialogue and the consciousness is there is a real art to looking through very large sets of data and how those are coded, how you can get to machine reading versus not of data. And I think that we're anticipating the data, we're not anticipating what is going to be required to actually turn that into knowledge.
So I think you make an amazing point, and we also need to take our healthcare blinders off. So yes, there's a lot of data that we should be looking at that we already have, or data we should be collecting better. But actually, to your point, I think if you took a data scientist, and I was just in a conversation about some rare diseases where a 6-minute walk test is used as an endpoint. Well, a 6-minute walk test is in a completely artificial environment. It's done in a clinic. There are a whole bunch of companies who have put devices on people. I bet a lot of people in the room are wearing one now that measure activity levels. What better way do we have to measure an endpoint that's related to somebody's activity than by comparing to consumer data?
So I want to go right off that, and then I'll, I think this will end that loop. So in Parkinson's, which could stand for any neurodegenerative disease, patients are usually seen once or twice a year for a total of 1 hour. And the assessment of where they are in their disease comes onto their EMR as they're at this level of moderate or severe Parkinson's, and 3 years later, it is moved to this. Max Little, who has worked at the MIT Media Lab, has taken the iPhone and using the voice pattern recognition, found a way to actually look at a voice gait. So when you talk, it actually has just as much of a disoriented gait as walking. And so in 1 minute on an iPhone, it's possible to have an evaluation of severe, moderate, to mild Parkinson's. But now, how's it being done? It's done on the iPhone, and it's being done as often as you want. So we have a project that we're working on with DARPA that would allow you to have that in the hands of, imagine, 100,000 patients with Parkinson's. And imagine if you had it in those individuals' hands and they were giving their narrative about how they were feeling, were they under stress, was this something they were doing, and you had the narratives going along at the same time as solving this undersampling problem that is coming in the medical records. So you've got good quality, real time, not in the doctor's office, data on Parkinson's. You've got narratives and you have objective information. We think it's possible to move anecdotal ideas that come up. A patient goes, I think this does this. And that might shorten the ability to actually know what the profile is for the patient. It might allow them to know what should be done, and it might even allow clinical trials to be much shorter because the baseline description on which you're trying to look at your drug is not a half-hour visit twice a year.
And you can't ignore that you just created an
I think
infinitely
Sue wants-
scalable diagnostic.
Glenn?
Yeah, so Matt, just at a really big picture level, I think there's two things that have been discussed today that relate to the question you posed for this panel, which is how much data and how big the data needs to be. And the answer is, honestly, it depends.
Well, yeah.
But the frustration that you're hearing, and there's a frustration and an opportunity. The frustration is in every other aspect of our lives today. Data is being used and algorithms are being used in ways that can be creepy. I don't want to leave that off, but can also be amazing. And there are two things we don't use in medicine, and you're hearing them in this conversation. One, and it came out really strongly in several of the panels, self-service. Many other aspects of our lives, we use self-service. I don't go inside a bank anymore. I don't call up a travel agent. So the cost of medicine in part is driven by how infrequently we are depending on self-service or lower level service when we need lower level service. We have the highest level and the highest expense for everything. So I think that's one aspect you're hearing. But the other one is there are many elements of what we do every day. If it's talking into our iPhone, where we do our grocery shopping, our exercise habits, there are many behavioral outputs that others, like Amazon, like Google, others are measuring about us to deliver ads to us or to sell us things that our caregivers don't have access to, and we as patients can't use. So I think that this whole thing about data that's not my blood pressure, that could be used to improve my health, is part of the challenge we should put in front of ourselves.
And that,
Yeah.
project was with Patients Like Me, so it's Patients Like Me and Sage that was doing that project. I just wanted to make sure that they got some recognition for that.
So,
www.
patients like me. So we've just resold everybody on how awesome this is, I think. But Sue started off on a different note, which is how does this overpromise? So how are we overpromising when we talk about what these data can do?
Fundamentally, the establishment infrastructure for looking at data and generating cures is broken in terms of the next wave of challenges. That a medical center that has 500 docs or 1,000 docs and a few hundred beds, no matter how big, no matter what their endowment, is completely the wrong place to keep and manage and curate data. They're not going to get connection into every up device and YouTube and Facebook and a million home-baked EKG machines. They're not going to be able to talk to each other because each one has a separate CIO with a separate team. And hey, we got our portal up in 3 days, the guy said at the last meeting. Oh, fabulous. A website in 2013, really? It's so bad. It's so bad. It's so backwards as compared to every other sector in our society. The idea that networks, that talk to other networks, that do back-end connections so that wherever you go, whether it's your Starbucks and your spend and your airport camera and your check-in, the idea that that stuff is available to get us a Venti from a Grande, push us to the Venti from the Grande, but not to identify that, hey, the people with the diagnosis or the phenotypical people that are perfect for this trial are actually not driving to the downtown university. They're in some place where they only eat, foods that generate diabetes, And what you need to do is find them out there, pop up alerts in that little doctor's office or FQHC and say, ask this, take a picture of this, and boop, that gets added to the cloud. But nobody's marching that way. We all know that we need that. We all can see it, and we can get DARPA to give us money and do an example of it. We can create a prototype and say, look what we can do. And we can also say, awesome, conference was great. We have this prototype that could happen. But when you turn around and look at real life, data in situ, data in the wild, it's just not connected. I sat in a hospital. I sat in an ambulance. And I drove in with a client and riding in their ambulance, doing a ride day. And this hospital has just gone live with a brand new electronic medical record. And everything was connected to this one medical. It was a very cool thing. It took them 3 years, $120 million. And we arrive in the ambulance, and out comes the 48-page printout of the electronic medical record, which we put underneath Betty. That's not her name, because this is HIPAA. And we roll Betty 1/4 of a mile to a nursing home that all the patients from that hospital get discharged to. We take Betty off the bed, and then we use the cot to type the medical record data that's relevant into the EMR for the ambulance company, which then has a central fax server, which faxes the bloody thing to the nursing home. I have it on I wish I could, holy Moses. And everybody had new computer systems that they were pretty psyched about. So to me, as we get to smaller and smaller drugs, right, we got to get away from the way we research. I even think we got to get away from the clinical trial as such a big deal. I'd like to see more sloppy, real-life biosurveillance of drugs. And my one silver lining is as people get ACOs or risk contracts, they might have personal interest in doing their own sloppy biosurveillance to see which drugs work better, whether they have CPT codes or not. Whew, I'm done.
Great.
This morning, I think, Matthew, you were up interviewing Patrick.
Yes.
And in some respects, with a nice amount of energy, with, as he said, a little bit of naivety. There is a solution that he brought forward. I'm just interested in what other panelists thought about whether that's the world that's coming Is it going to come from people like him? Is it going to come from Google? Is it going to come, where is that integration? And I think that's what you're talking about,
Yeah.
integration. Is that integration going to come from Athena?
Well, you know, we tried to integrate with a lot of the hospitals and failed for several years because they didn't want to make it too easy for patients to flow out. CIOs just spent $1 gazillion on a system, and they really want everybody on that system, and I don't blame them. But then Target and Minute Clinic, who are both on AthenaNet, said, you know what, you get in there and you connect. And Target and Minute Clinic said, if you don't connect, we're going to think of someone else to send our sick patients to. And all of a sudden, we have a tunnel into Epic Systems, which is the big, cool one that everyone's got, and Cerner. And now, all of a sudden, the data's starting to flow. Memorial Sloan Kettering just said we could we could turn on this tunnel and start flowing patients. So it was in fact the multi-state sort of low end of the food chain, break-fix players that were finally able to break open. And what's interesting is once we got a tunnel into these guys, as long as we've got a HIPAA need to know, we can start to be not just the billing record, but maybe the CIRRUS, maybe maybe we can help the Center for Collaborative Care that you guys work pulling, data together to get enough patients to do a trial across many medical centers. Maybe a little Athena or people like us that are just connecting for referral, just to get the retail clinics connected will become, that's the thing that's got me excited right now. It's like, wow, well, maybe it'll work.
Anybody want to ask a question? Do we have someone up there in the balcony? Who I can't see, but just start talking.
Hi. Hi. The Chief Investment Officer of New Delhi-based Spice Global. I believe that it's not only revolutionary, but evolutionary that healthcare records will be taken to the cloud, webified, and mobilized. There are bigger names like HealthVault and less known ones like Practice Fusion. With the understanding that trust is paramount and our health information will be data mined, hopefully scrubbed, then resold and researched, the rise of urgent care and independent clinics leads to either further fragmented industry.
I'm sorry, do you have a question?
Yeah, it's right here. Must there be a singular Google-like leader to aggregate the ecosystem and disseminate the records in the cloud, or is there room for various disparate systems to cohabitate and create that ecosystem?
So let me answer that.
The question
You
Steve
got
was
it.
asking.
You got it.
Because I think if you think about what's happening in the cloud, the answer to that by definition is no. Right? The cloud is about people having a very narrow focus and doing something extraordinarily well at tremendous scale, whether that's selling books or doing web search or having people search for books that they will then buy. It's how people connect those really vertical disciplines. And I think, actually, to Jonathan's point, we need to take an incrementalist approach to getting to these big ideas. It's not going to happen with a big bang, because actually, to your point about a website, connecting two pieces of data in 2013 is not sexy and it's not even interesting. What's interesting is getting somebody to want to connect them to, for example, combine a set of controlled data from a clinical trial with a set of registry data to produce some effect. And I think you got to applaud the incrementalist approach where people say, let's create a prize and create a compelling event for this. Right. That will drive demand at the medical centers and at the pharma companies.
Yeah.
And at regulators too, which I think is an important demand point.
Yeah, and I think to answer the question, if you look at how the internet took off, it was cat pages. It was actually people who cared about really silly things, wanting to do something they had a lot of passion to do. And it is my guess that the cat pages of this health sharing and records going around will be a set of patients, whether they have Fanconi anemia or whether they have this or that go, I don't have any barriers. I want to solve that problem. And those will not be the end solution, but I think the type of project that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is funding us to do, called Bridge, which has the citizen acting as the giver of the data, part of the research team, looking at the data, seeing how it flows, are one of 100 experiments. And I think, so you're doing a couple of those at UCSF.
I think what we need something that's a shared public good. And that could be a database that people have access to. And I think if you look at some of what's going on with the Cancer Genome Project, there's a shared public good, but people have to have a certain level of credibility to participate in that shared public good. And then you're going to see people who want to make a profit. And you'll see people who are making a business out of accessing the shared public good, very much like what happens with the internet today. And then the third element of this is volunteerism. So I really endorse this sense that very much to the point where I might want to donate blood or donate my stem cells or donate a kidney. I think we will see that people sharing their data is seen as volunteerism. And you'll have to have that public good, wish for a profit, and volunteerism all stirred up together to make this work.
What do you think of shared public goods?
Yeah, not a big fan of the shared public good idea. I mean, I'm a big fan of you, but I do think we need there'll be a sustainable market for exchange, and you'll see the number of nodes decline over time. There won't be a big Google, I don't think. There isn't one today, right? There's many, or a few. I doubt the isolated islands with one CIO trying to hold together every modality of information flow inside of one building will last for long. But I imagine a network of networks, and my vision, I think, is that the way it'll hold together is through a series of interchange fees. So there'll be a market, hey, if I've got more patients than you, then you're gonna pay me more interchange fees, and vice versa, and just the way banks work today. So you no longer slow down and look at the back of your bank card and check it against the glass door of the bank machine. You just jam your card in and you assume someone's gonna figure out who gets your $3. And I see that really starting to happen. It's in its infancy, but I think the government's been supportive despite anti-kickback law, which is in the way of it. And, I think that'll work.
Just to push back on shared public, I haven't completely turned into a public servant, just to assure you. I think every day all of us use things like the International Classification of Disease, the WHO, the language we all use on the internet. I consider those all shared public goods that you and I both interact with and utilize, including the bank system, knock on wood. So I think there has to be some underpinning of something that we all agree to, that I'm calling a shared public good, or else you have utter chaos.
It could be a shared key.
A shared key,
A
I'm fine with
federally
that.
owned database by Lockheed Martin that holds all the data sort of tears it apart.
Hoarding data is not going to be a
Next
viable
question.
business
Right,
model.
right.
It's what you do with
Start
that data to
talking.
take action.
Plow in.
Hi, I'm Paul Bleischer. I'm from Optum Labs. And I have a comment, actually. As we've amassed a lot of data, what we wound up with is a lot of people who've come to us and talked about, why don't you use machine learning and other methodologies? And there's a significant danger there. I'd like to ask the panel to comment on that, because if you're doing machine learning with Amazon data, the biggest mistake you can make is you can market the wrong thing to the wrong person. But unless you're applying big science to the big data, you can wind up making very, very bad conclusions. Individuals can make bad conclusions about themselves that could lead them to do bad things. Poor researchers can pull out with unsupervised machine learning answers and results that are actually exactly the opposite of the truth. So how do you deal with the balance that's necessary when dealing with medical data between complete access and quality analysis?
How do you know
just
you're right?
a quick comment on this from so Charles Sawyers and I co-chair this precision medicine report through the National Research Council that came out in 2011. And we recognize the issue you're talking about. There's a fundamental difference between hypothesis generation and validated conclusions. So we differentiated between the knowledge network that we called for in this report and a crucial step that may be FDA, maybe CMS, where there is a validation step that transports a bunch of data and hypotheses into clinically actionable outcomes. And I think any such system has to differentiate between the messiness, appropriate messiness of research, and the caregiver utilization or patient utilization of validated information.
I was going to say, I think machine learning is a tool, right? And I think everything you just said, you could have said the same thing without using machine learning. People can do bad research and make bad conclusions.
Yeah.
So you just need the discipline of science.
They can
behind
also
whatever.
just not move and stay doing the same dumb thing for years and years and years. How many years between when we knew we should use penicillin and when we did? How many years between when we knew we shouldn't do episiotomies and when we stopped? How many years between when we knew we shouldn't do continuous fetal monitoring during labor and when we stopped? I mean, I think some hospitals are still banging away at it. So, the Hippocratic Oath should slow down the lean cycle of, we should go slower than, video games or social networks. Like if the site blows up, everyone just picks up their sleeping bag and their push-up pops and goes to the next social network and it's fine. So we're not there, but on the continuum, like, I hope that this proliferation of institutions bearing some financial risk causes a little more experimentation than the dutiful and appropriate conservatism that's kept us from fixing obvious leaks.
But can we get answers from this stuff, Jonathan, do you think, that will be as good or as true as clinical trials?
So honestly, I'm wondering, you guys are experts. It seems to me that you could get answers that are better. Like, you're not allowed to do a clinical trial on an off-label thing, right? And the clinical trials, the conditions are so pristine that you could never replicate clinical trial conditions in real life. You know, what if they take the subway with a whole bunch of people that smell funny and they've got a thing, and, you know, there's a million things that cause real life to not behave like clinical trials, and the drug is going to be used in real life. What are we at? 70% of drugs we actually don't use for the thing they were approved for? So I actually think that we'll get closer to more effectiveness if we get past FDA and get a lot of people trying to doing sort of more in situ biosurveillance on different treatment protocols, even though many will be dumb. You know, here's to the crazy ones, right? But I don't know. I shouldn't talk so much.
No,
Go ahead.
I liked the core message that you were giving there, which is the concept that there is some sacred element in the clinical trial, and only some things can be done by clinical trial, I think has being anointed as the gold standard in a way which several points that you made actually call into question. And I think that when you have large amounts of data from citizens and the broader context is what's being driven, there are going to be times when that validation phase may need a core set in that validation that the FDA or some other place may have to do to sort of complete the loop. But the appropriateness of that broader collection of information, the much less expensive way to get at answers in real time, I think,
right,
are where it's going to go. And I think that the point about one of the puzzles is how can we use things that are not machine learnable or machine readable to actually have value? What is the role of this or that? I think was also.
I think we need to hear Sue's perspective on this because she is one of the great deans of running clinical trials.
So I think that this is right tool for right problem.
Right.
I think when you're talking about a real life situation, a lot of the big data, crowdsourcing, a la the anti-TNF.
This is the question you asked earlier.
I know, but I didn't get an answer. So I think that the bottom line is post-marketing surveillance, big data sets, real life, being on the subway is perfect for post-marketing surveillance. Better than anything you can construct and more cost-effective than what you can construct. Second indications for already approved drugs. I think there's a lot we can do with patient registries and observational data, second indications. What is really hard is the thought that you have a brand new hypothesis, that drug X is the perfect drug for condition Y. The first indication, as we sit here today, the highest level of proof is a randomized controlled clinical trial. And I think any one of us who had a loved one, and I'll give you an example. When we first studied Avastin, Gwen Fife and I recognized that we were giving a patient one of the most powerful anti-angiogenics we had ever seen, and that was the first patient on earth who would get that medicine. And neither of us slept all night, thinking, what happens to a patient? I mean, I kind of like my blood vessels, I bet you do too, who gets anti-VEGF for the first time. So that was extraordinarily innovative to treat a cancer patient with an anti-angiogenic. I would submit that I want the highest and best proof, a classic, expensive, randomized controlled clinical trial. Here we are today, 10 years later, the next anti-angiogenic saying, okay, we could do better in colon cancer. How could you do that in an observation study? How could you import that into the normal course of clinical care? And because the hypothesis has been proven but needs to be understood with more safety, what's the right timing, what's the best agent, but that's 10 years after we validated that anti-angiogenesis could be a great way to treat cancer patients and that we could get away with it.
Next question. We have one way up there.
Richard Bellotti, Medical Pain Center in Omaha, Nebraska. I want to shift the question a little bit from research more to clinical practice. I'm a practicing physician, And increasingly with data collection, I'm finding my practice turning from the practice of medicine to the practice of data input.
Registry of motor vehicles.
Yeah, and so instead of talking to my patient, I have my back to my patient and I'm busy typing into the terminal. How can we continue to practice medicine and yet still provide data for clinical care for our patients?
Well, one of the,
You should. You make the
you
AMR,
got my
so.
wheelhouse here. One of the other benefits of an open network is the information is not just managed in the exam room or within the walls of the clinic or the hospital, right? I mean, the right place to find out somebody's address is freaking Facebook, right? I mean, half of the forms that people fill out inside the practice, they fill out improperly because they're, you know, on stage almost. So what has to happen across the entire healthcare spectrum is the theory of comparative advantage, which I think Ricardo sort of came up with in about 1700, ought to come finally to healthcare, right? The right person to talk about themselves is the patient in their own setting, online, you know, the right person to deal with talking through those questions is a nice chatty person who knows their social demographic context and can draw people out. And then you finally get to a diagnostician or a procedure expert. But the movement must be out of the clinic walls for the stuff that doesn't belong in the clinical walls. And the stuff about how you're feeling today, who are you, where do you live, how are you going to pay, is a prime example. But it also goes out the other end into chronic care, right? The idea of bringing someone back in once a month to look at their CHF, like, CHF, you got to look at it every minute of every day, all the time, with their up and their, this is what kale is and you can eat it, and all the things that are related to chronic disease. So you're living, the bureaucratic end of, tip of a long spear that moving care to the cloud, moving care information to the cloud should resolve.
I would just make the observation that, and we've dealt with this a lot as we've put electronic health records in place, it's early days and it really is difficult and excruciating for caregivers to have to turn their back on patients and type something into a terminal. So I think what I'm seeing is, driven by caregivers and patients, a movement to what kind of tool can we use so you can still be face-to-face, that you can spend more time interacting, caring, compassion, a lot of the words we heard this morning, and yet nobody wants to give up capturing that information in more portable, meaningful ways that we can capture for that on behalf of that patient and their family. So I think it's just that 1.0 of electronic health records, and it will get better.
Longest wait award goes to this one.
Yeah, so.
Hi, Elizabeth Forbes. So you talk about big data and shared public data. Just going at a small data kind of grassroots level, do you think that putting almost pressure, I guess, on hospitals and such to create these networks and integrate everything, do you think you could start at a more grassroots level, go to these patient message boards and stuff? And if so, I mean, we have, Rome wasn't built in a day, so change takes time, but if with all these difficulties to break down the silos, are any of you or other institutions
Ethan, this sounds like you.
at the grassroots level?
Because that's where the energy is, that's where the passion, that's where the willingness is. And so I think absolutely, and in fact, it's almost like we don't have to, they're coming at us, whether it's patients with Fanconi anemia, whether it's the chordoma, whether it's ataxia. I think trying to watch those experiments that are going on is going to be key to getting the answers for the larger data flows.
Well, just one comment. I mentioned the volunteerism. So a really simple way to think about this is, I'll volunteer my data only if you share it. So I'll volunteer only if, instead of this silo that your institution could create using my data, the price of me volunteering my data is that it's available to anybody who's going to do research on what I care about.
I would posit that you might not even be saying to that small institution, I'm volunteering my data for you. The real grassroots action might be at an organization that looks thinner and looks like they have less data, but it's one level up.
Right.
And it's consolidating all that energy, and you're volunteering your data to
Absolutely.
them. And they bypass all those siloed systems to begin with. Right? We should expect curve jumping, leapfrogging in this inherently technology-focused problem we're trying